and welcome to the API Security Fundamentals course. My name is Dan Barahona, and I'll be your instructor for this course. We created the API Security Fundamentals course to really introduce the topic of API security and to provide a solid foundation for the key concepts for building a secure API program in your organization. Let's take a look at what we'll be covering.
So what are we going to cover here today? So it's going to be about 90 minutes, maybe a little more. And we're going to start with a little bit of background. The introduction is really going to talk about, why are we even talking about API security? Why is this an important topic? Why should we take it seriously? What are the risks of APIs? And we'll segue that into a section on real-world API breaches. So we're going to go through in some detail examples of how APIs have been exploited, data has been lost, inappropriate or fraudulent transactions executed successfully. We'll go through that in some detail. They're going to go into the OWASP API security top 10 and really dig into what are each of the elements of the top 10 and what you should know about them, what are the risks that they pose, some examples, and how to prevent those types of risks in your organization. We'll then go into what we call the 3 pillars of API security, which are governance, which really has to do with how do you consistently and securely develop APIs. The second is testing, which is how do we make sure that those APIs are properly validated and secured and free of vulnerabilities. And the third element is monitoring, which is, how do we go about, verifying that our controls are working properly, that there aren't attacks in flight that we need to know about or to mitigate. From there, we'll talk about the application security technology landscape. There are a ton of different tools around API or around security in general. And we'll talk specifically about the application security space and the various technologies that exist, what they give you, and where there are gaps that you need to be aware of and to address. And then we'll wrap up with a few concluding thoughts and best practices.
Before we get started, let me share a little bit about myself. My name is Dan Barahona. I'm one of the co-founders here at APIsec University. I've got over 20 years of cybersecurity experience at companies like Qualys and Anomaly, ArcSight, and of course here at APIsec. I've held leadership roles in product management, sales, and marketing. Have engineering degrees from Rensselaer and Cornell University and an MBA from University of Michigan. I'd love to be in touch with you, so please don't hesitate to reach out, connect on LinkedIn, or shoot me an email. Happy to hear from you. Thanks for signing up.
So let's get right into the core of the course here, and really talk about why is this a topic worth talking about? Right? Why is API security something that requires a course? And before we even get into that, let's just talk about what APIs are and what do they do. All right, so it stands for Application Programming Interface, and you use them all the time whether you realize it or not. Right, and here are a few examples. So if you've ever tried to book a Lyft ride through a Google map, how does that exchange actually happen? Well, Google is communicating through an API to Lyft to request fare information, availability of cars, to actually execute the ride request when you click on submit. That's all being accomplished through APIs. Or if you've ever sent money through a payment app like Venmo, how's that communicating with your Wells Fargo account, for example, right? And securely authenticating as you to your account and pulling funds out to deliver to another party. That's all being done through APIs. If you've ever looked up, airfare information on an aggregator site like Kayak, they're using APIs to communicate with all the different airlines to fetch information to present to you all the different options. And that's just examples of APIs being shared externally, right, across organizations. But APIs also power our internal applications, right, the microservices. If you've got an authentication microservice over in your organization, then another developer may need to use that functionality for their application, for the code that they are developing, and they will use the APIs that have been developed for authentication. So it can be used internally. It can be used to power your mobile and web applications. It can be used to expose to third parties, to trusted partners and customers who may want to integrate with your platform. So these APIs have really changed how we build and develop and deploy applications. And we've seen this explosive growth. It's really quite remarkable. Whole industry has emerged around APIs and API management. Akamai reported a few years ago that on their networks, fully 80+% of all the traffic was actually API communication, server-to-server communication taking place, or between applications and backends and so forth. So really remarkable adoption. Whole businesses, whole categories have evolved as a result of the adoption of APIs. But along with that, of course, has come a cybersecurity risk, and Gartner has long said that that by last year, 2022, APIs would become the number one most frequent attack vector, and I think that has turned out to be true, and you'll see that in the coming sections when we talk about real world breaches, just how true that is, and that has resulted in some pretty remarkable high-profile breaches. We'll show you some examples, but very significant volumes of data, very significant access has been granted through APIs with unknown vulnerabilities, with logic gaps and the like. So there is a very significant risk that comes with APIs that needs to be addressed and mitigated. And of course, there's a regulatory compliance angle as well. The auditors are very much aware of APIs. They need to be part of your sort of internal risk assessment, and to demonstrate that you're actually taking proper steps to address the risks of APIs. And let's look at what kind of things are being stolen. This is really just tip of the iceberg. What you see with APIs is you don't lose 10, 20, 100, or 1,000 records. You lose millions. In the case of Experian, the ability to look up the credit records of any individual in the United States. The Bumble app, 100 million users exposed through a leaky API. Everyone on LinkedIn had their information harvested through an API. Venmo had 200 million transactions in full detail harvested through a vulnerable API. Fraudulent transactions executed through API. So you can see why this is such a ripe target for hackers, for attackers. And there are a few reasons why that is. Why is it that APIs are such a target? If you look at this very simple sort of schematic, you've got the back-end application. That's where all the data lives and the functionality. If I want to book a vacation or upload a file to a file share or send a message through a messaging platform, all that functionality exists on the back end, but that functionality gets exposed to the user through APIs, whether that be through a web app that's using the APIs to communicate with the back end, or a mobile app, or it's powering the microservices and internal applications that make all this functionality possible, or we're publishing APIs so that our customers and partners and third parties can make use of this information. APIs are really this sort of central choke point for the flow of data between the interfaces and the back end. What we find is that when we look sort of under the hood at these APIs inside organizations, not only do they provide direct access to this sensitive information and data, but it also, these APIs are often over permissioned. We find that they have excessive rights granted to those APIs, and these are the types of things that can create these logic flaws. You'll see many examples of these in the coming slides, but it creates these opportunities, these gaps in the functionality that can be exploited by attackers. The other reason why APIs are such an interesting target for attack is they make life a whole lot easier for the attackers. If you think about kind of the classic cyber attack, it's also known as the kill chain. And frankly, this is an oversimplified view of it, but it takes a lot of sophistication and a whole lot of steps, from sort of infiltrating the organization through reconnaissance, and then weaponizing, getting someone to click on a phishing email or get malware to download. But from there, the attacker has to move laterally and escalate privileges and find the data and exfiltrate and so forth. It's a multi-step, takes a long time, a lot of sophistication. But with APIs, it's a whole different kill chain. If you can find a vulnerability, then you can exploit it, and you're pretty much done at that point. And you'll see many such examples of this in the coming slides. Let's just talk about some of the regulatory implications of APIs as well. I won't go through all the details here. In banking, of course, you've got FFIEC and open banking. You've got PCI. Healthcare's got privacy and interoperability, and so on and so forth. All the frameworks are now quite explicit about API requirements. But what does it really boil down to? There's really three, in some ways, competing challenges of APIs and of these regulatory requirements. You've got a security requirement, which basically says you have to ensure that the applications, that the services that you're running are secure, right? That they have proper controls in place, that you're testing the vulnerabilities and mitigating them, you're reviewing the findings and taking action, and so forth. So there's a whole security element to it. Then you've got privacy. So if you've got things like personally identifiable information, protected health information, any sensitive data, you are mandated to protect it, whether it's under something like GDPR or CCPA here in California, or PIPEDA in Canada, or many others across the globe. There are regulatory requirements to protect this information, and there are very significant penalties when PII gets breached and harvested. The largest I've seen is something on the order of $700 million fine. Can be, I think GDPR has up to 4% of top line revenue penalties. So there's a need here to protect the information. But there is also a competing need to make data accessible, whether it's for business purposes, to enable partners and clients to have access to functionality, or from a regulatory perspective. In healthcare, for example, you've got the Cures Act, which mandates interoperability. It says you have to make patient information not only accessible in the form of papers and printed copies, but also electronically through APIs. Or in the financial arena, you've got open banking, for example, in the EU, which is mandatory. In the United States, you've got things like financial data exchange, which are more voluntary, but very widely adopted. And it basically requires that we make our platforms open and accessible. So you've got these competing challenges of securing the data as well as making it accessible.
Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Ashley Tucker, and I'm the community manager here at APIsec University. Right now, you're watching our beginner course, API Security Fundamentals. I hope you're enjoying the content so far. If you would like to earn the badge that comes after successfully completing this course, sign up on apisecuniversity.com and get started today. Let's get back to the course.
So that wraps up kind of our introduction to APIs. Now let's talk about some real world breaches and really kind of understand how were these attacks executed, what made them successful, and what kind of harm was done through it. We'll go through a bunch of different examples. I want to be clear that this is not finger pointing. Each of these companies employed a lot of the correct technologies for securing their networks, their infrastructure, their applications, but it just goes to show how how clever attacks can be in finding vulnerabilities and weaknesses in APIs. And you'll see a bunch of different examples here, like at Coinbase, where there was unauthorized trading possible through a vulnerable API, or at Instagram, where you could literally take over any user's account through an API attack, as well as things like T-Mobile, where the exposure was not only a loss of data, but a need to report to a federal regulator. Or in the case of Optus, where the impact was a ransom demand, and so forth. So there's a lot of different ways that API attacks can achieve their intended goals. We'll start with Coinbase. We'll go into a little more detail on this one because there's a lot to know, and it's a quite interesting example. So what happened here? Coinbase is the crypto trading platform. And a security researcher discovered a vulnerability that effectively allowed them to sell crypto that they did not own. And for this, they were rewarded with the largest bug bounty that they've ever paid. And what you see down here on the bottom left is really the tweet that he published that says, "I just sold Bitcoin, a pair I do not have access to and do not hold. And I was able to successfully trade this." And what they did was they looked at the traffic between the web interface and the back end. So they basically reverse engineered or sniffed the traffic between the application and the back end and identified the API calls that were taking place. There were 4 parameters in that call, which I'll show you on the next screen. And he was able to manipulate those to basically trade crypto on an account that did not belong to him. You'll see these red boxes on each of these slides indicating what type of an OWASP sort of attack this maps to. In this case, this is an OWASP number 1, which is very common, a broken object level authorization, and we'll of course talk a lot more about that in the OWASP section. But let's dissect this a little bit further. Here is what he was able to see in the traffic, and you'll see here in the yellow box the 4 items, the 4 elements of a transaction. So there was the product ID, which is what he was trading, the order, so in this case a sell, and then a source account and a target account. And he effectively overwrote the source account to be an account that did not belong to him. And it's not something you could even possibly do through the web interface, but in an API call, you can construct any type of request that you like. And so he simply changed the source account from user A to user B. And down below, you can see sort of the confirmation of his successful transaction. And at this point, he knew he had stumbled across a very significant flaw, contacted the company, and the company did a very fine job of reacting. First thing they did was to shut down the service, reproduce the issue, and then to issue a fix. And by I think the next day the site was back up. They also blogged about it, and what was interesting, they were very clear that the issue, the cause of the bug was a missing logic validation check in their brokerage application. So there was a gap, right? The app was not confirming that the user submitting the transaction owned the accounts related to the transaction. And this is a classic, what's known as BOLA, or broken object level authorization flaw, where effectively user A is able to act on behalf of another user. When this attacker tried that same request the following day, he got an error. And as you can see here, source account does not match product ID. So they were able to insert the logic into the application to prevent that type of an activity from happening. But until it had been discovered, that was a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Next, we'll go a little bit quicker through the rest of these, but each one of them has a unique story. So the next one is U.S. Postal Service, and they had an API called Informed Visibility that really anybody could sign up and gain access to their account information, their mail scans, and other details. And the Postal Service, as required annually, had performed a web vulnerability scan on their application, and they did discover some APIs that lacked authentication. So they went ahead and fixed that, and deemed that the site was now up to compliance, and sort of a green or clean bill of health was issued. What they did not do was actually really properly test the APIs themselves, because shortly thereafter, an attacker discovered that not only could they access this API through an authentication, so they were setting up an account and properly authenticating, but once they were in, they could not only see their own records, but they could see the records of their next door neighbor, or Michael Jordan, or really anyone with an address in the system. And this is another example of an OWASP number 1, where effectively user A is accessing the records of, in this case, 60 million other user accounts. So the problem of they were authenticating users, they were not authorizing users and controlling what those users could see. Similar example here with Peloton. In this case, they had an API that they must have not expected anyone to use because it had no authentication on it. So literally wide open to the outside world if you were clever enough to find it and to attempt to use it. A researcher notified Peloton about this, and after some time, Peloton added the authentication to it. What was interesting was not only could the researcher see all 4 million users' records, but if you as a user had marked your account as private and not to be discoverable by other users on the Peloton platform, the API would ignore that and actually had full access to the entire database, regardless of whether you had marked your records as private, including those of the president as well. So Peloton added authentication to this API and ensured that users were required to validate who they were. Not a hard thing to obtain, but did not address the underlying authorization issue. And so even though users were now being forced to authenticate, they could still access all 4 million users. This is an example of not only OWASP number 1, but also OWASP number 2, which is broken authentication. The fact that API endpoint was left unsecured to begin with is a vulnerability and an exposure, certainly an API endpoint that has access to the entire user database. Next on the list is Venmo. You're probably all familiar with Venmo, the payment platform. Now on the Venmo homepage, this is meant to be sort of a very public, almost like social payment platform. And so on the homepage, they would present kind of like real-time transactions, or the most recent 10, 20 transactions as they were happening. And they would be sure to strip out identifiable information, last names and descriptions and things like that. And a security researcher looked at this and decided to sort of sniff the traffic between the homepage and the back end, and identified an API that was powering this feature. And he decided to try to call that API directly, and it worked. Did not require authentication, so that's an OWASP number 2 violation. But what he discovered was the API would return not anonymized data, but all the unanonymized data. So full details of the sender and the recipient, the description, the dollar amounts, all of that information was coming back to the requester. And that's an example of a broken object property level authorization, or basically excessive data exposure. In this case, the use case for the homepage was show anonymized data. And they used an API that would return unanonymized data. So the filtering was happening in the UI, not at the app level. And that's really where it should have been addressed. Beyond that, this researcher discovered that they could write a short script and basically, ping the Venmo server up to 115,000 times a day, spreading that across 2 different IP addresses, and over time, ratchet that up to harvest 200 million different transactions in their full detail. And that's OWASP number 4, which is unrestricted resource consumption. And that basically has to do with high volume, unrestricted, uncontrolled access to vast amounts of data and resources. So there were not controls to prevent that kind of mass harvesting from occurring here on the Venmo platform.
Next up, we have Instagram, and this is an example of an API exploit that allowed a full account takeover. What happened here was there was an API that could be exploited to help reset a particular user's password. So if you're a user of Instagram and you'd forgotten your password, you would hit the reset password button. Like on any other site, it would send an email to that user with in this case, a 6-digit code. It turns out that the 6-digit code can be supplied through an API back to the Instagram server in order to reset the account. So the attacker requested a reset code. Of course, they did not receive it in their email, and instead attempted to brute force all 1 million combinations of that code. Instagram, though, had some rate controls. They limited the number of guesses to 200 per IP address, but they did not limit the number of guesses across multiple IP addresses. And what this researcher discovered was they could simply rotate IP addresses after every 200 guesses, utilizing up to 5,000 different IPs to get through all 1 million combinations and effectively take over any user's account. So what really needed to be in place here was, frankly, an expiration of the reset code and a prevention of mass requests on that same account from multiple IP addresses.
Next one we have here is Bumble. This is the dating app. In this case, 95 million users' account information was harvested. First of all, no authentication. So as we know, that's OWASP 2, broken authentication or weak authentication. Beyond that, the attacker discovered the use of incremental IDs. So, all 95 million users had an ID that was simply an incrementing digit. This is a really poor practice because you want to make it difficult to enumerate and to harvest data. So having user 001 followed by 002 and 003 makes it quite easy for that type of harvesting to happen. So you want to employ randomized identifiers with numbers and letters and so forth to make it difficult to actually sort of increment through your database and harvest. Beyond this, the data that was coming back was very detailed, and it even included the distance from the requester to the user being searched. And this particular person was crafty and decided to create 3 different accounts, and they could literally triangulate and find the exact pinpoint position of every user on the platform. But beyond that, you see what here is OWASP number 5, which is broken function level authorization. So beyond being able to access the records, they actually had function level access, i.e. functions like update and delete and so forth. Functions that should not have ever been available to an end user. And he could even do things like change an account type from, say, a free unpaid account to a paid premium account without, of course, making any payments whatsoever, and do that for literally any user on the platform. So in this case, the API was exposing not only the data, but also functional capabilities and the ability to manipulate the data itself. Next up is T-Mobile, which we mentioned a little bit earlier. In this case, we don't actually know a whole lot about what happened, but what we do know from here at the bottom is that a bad actor was able to obtain data through a single API without authorization. So we know that without authorization means that's a broken authentication or a lack of authentication. And in this case, the exposure was 37 million users of the T-Mobile service. And this resulted in the need to file a documentation with the Securities and Exchange Commission to inform of the breach and to provide details. And of course, I'm sure there are notification requirements for each and every one of those users. So the impact here goes beyond the loss of data, but there's also reputational risk, reputational damage, and even the need to file with a regulatory governing body. Here we are with the last couple. Optus is a large telco in Australia. They had a massive breach, and as you can see, vulnerable APIs were to blame. Again, an API endpoint with no authentication, right? OWASP, which is an OWASP number 2 violation. They were able to harvest 9.8 million user details, including things like driver's license IDs, Medicare IDs, name, phone, email, and more. And this is a violation of OWASP 4 and sort of excessive data harvesting. But what they chose to do with this was to basically ransom the data to Optus and demand a $1 million payment for non-exposure or non-publishing of this information. They went on the dark web and released samples, 10,000 samples of the data. It was validated to be legitimate. And their demand was to Optus for a $1 million payment to prevent the full detail or full disclosure of all the data. And our last one here is Experian. This is quite interesting because this reveals the exposure, the risk that APIs can have from third parties. So you're familiar with Experian. It's the credit reporting agency, and what they did was create an API to provide to their financial partners, banks and loan approvers and so forth. And one of their many partners decided to take that API and publish a website where loan applicants could actually look up their credit scores. And little did they know, behind the scenes, this site was utilizing the Experian API. That site was discovered by a researcher who then, sniffed the traffic, identified the API, saw that it was an Experian API, and decided to try to call it directly themselves, which it permitted. What was interesting here was that they could, with an individual's name and address and date of birth, they could look up the credit score of any particular user in the entire Experian database. But beyond that, it turned out that the date of birth field was really a placeholder. You could put any values you wanted. You could put all zeros in that field, and the Experian database would respond with the credit records of any user that they had. This is an example of what is OWASP number 9, improper inventory management, and that's really about having a full and accurate knowledge of your APIs, where they are, how they're being used, and making sure that your APIs are not being abused by third parties in ways that you don't authorize. So that wraps up our real world examples. And what you see here is a lot of commonalities, right? We see a lot of broken authentication where there's inadequate security being enforced sort of at the gate. We see a lot of broken object level authorization. So, you might be authenticating users, but then giving them access to records that they shouldn't be. There's a lot of data harvesting, so excess data exposure, sensitive data coming back or high volumes of data coming back. And of course, here you see the risk that third parties can create as well.
Are you already familiar with penetration testing? Check out our API penetration testing course. Go through course topics such as lab setup, API reconnaissance, endpoint analysis, scanning APIs, API authentication attacks, exploiting API authorization, testing for improper assets management, mass assignment attacks, injection attacks, rate limit testing, and also combining techniques. All of this is taught by instructor and our Chief Hacking Officer, Corey Ball. Easily enroll now and start your API penetration testing course today.
So moving on to our next section, let's talk through the OWASP API Security Top 10. You may have heard of the OWASP before. It is the Open Web Application Security Project. There are two different OWASP Top 10, so just make sure you're aware of which one you're talking about or looking at. The classic OWASP Top 10, what you see here on the left, is really for web applications. And this has really become the standard for developers and security teams to understand the types of risks that exist with their web applications. But along the way in 2019, the group determined that with the adoption of APIs, there was a need for an API-specific top 10, and that's what you see here on the right. The API Security Top 10 was first issued in 2019. There's some overlap with the web top 10, but a whole lot of new unique requirements for the API top 10. Now, in 2023, a new edition of the OWASP API top 10 has been released, and that's what I'll talk about here in the coming slides. This is what the 2023 OWASP API top 10 looks like. There's some renaming, there's some merging of categories, and then there are some entirely new categories that have been added. So starting with number one, broken object level authorization. As we've discussed, this is really, there's a reason why it's number one on the list. It's the most common and the most damaging, frankly, of the API top 10 items. Involves manipulating IDs, gaining access to records that do not belong to you. And as you've seen, it can lead to data loss, data manipulation, disclosure. And the example is quite simple. You authenticate as user A, and then you attempt to access information that belongs to another user. And if that works, then you iterate and continue potentially to harvest vast amounts of data. So the prevention side here is to really thoughtfully define what your access control policies are, right? To know, what access a given user or given role should have access to, and then to enforce that at the application logic layer, right? Don't enforce that in the UI, don't enforce it in the API itself, but you need to actually enforce that kind of control within the application logic itself. And you want to implement automated testing to make sure that no exposures or gaps are being revealed or sort of entering into your application code logic. So, continuous and comprehensive testing, not once or twice a year, but on every release. Because these kinds of vulnerabilities can creep in whenever there's a new code release or a new functionality added to your application. Moving on to OWASP number 2, which is broken authentication. As the name suggests, this is really about poor or weak or non-existent authentication to endpoints. This is number 2, also for a reason. As you've seen, it's very common. The exposure naturally is the access of other users' accounts, data theft, unauthorized transactions. Examples of weak authentication, things like weak password requirements, vulnerability to credential stuffing and brute forcing of IDs and passwords, which are quite readily available on the dark web. Lack of CAPTCHAs or rate limiting or lockouts on accounts, putting authentication info into URLs, which can be sniffed and reused by malicious parties, changing passwords without authentication or verification, not validating tokens, not storing passwords properly. So again, the prevention here is to really properly define what your authentication requirements are and to tailor those requirements to the use case, right? So if you've got an endpoint that performs fairly benign functionality, then maybe no authentication is perfectly fine. If you've got another endpoint that's accessing PII, then you probably want to make sure that you're enforcing very strict authentication, tokens, timeouts, and then of course you're implementing logic to ensure that those users only see what they're entitled to see. Again, you want to implement continuous testing to make sure no changes are creeping into code logic or into the infrastructure that may be exposing new authentication vulnerabilities. All right, next up, this is broken object property level authorization. This is a new entry into the top 10, but it's actually in some ways a merger of two of the old categories of mass assignment, which is really about the ability to update object elements within an API endpoint, as well as the old excessive data exposure category, which is about revealing data, unnecessarily sensitive data for the particular use case of that particular application. Some examples of what this can look like is manipulating an object ID, say account type, and overriding say a free account to a premium account. Right. This is an example of a mass assignment where you can actually modify and update object values, or an endpoint. Let's say it was you have an endpoint to do a user search or something like that. Then no need to be returning account IDs and emails and other sensitive information when the use case doesn't require it. Right. So the prevention here is to make sure your API endpoints are returning the data that is legitimately required for that application and nothing more, right? Do not rely on filtering in the UI to do that work for you. Make sure your APIs are only returning the data that the application, that the use case requires. And then make sure that users can only access the info they need and cannot modify data that they should not have the opportunity or the ability to modify. Moving on to OWASP number 4, this is unrestricted resource consumption. This used to be called lack of resources and rate limiting, but really has to do with these sort of high volume type of attacks, right? The mass data harvesting and so forth. It can result not only in huge amounts of data loss, but even things like denial of service and operational impact as well. So examples here, missing or inadequate rate control. So, the ability to harvest data in excess of what an application should require. There's no need for a user to query 1,000 times when a typical user is only going to access once or twice. Lack of timeouts or of control of memory or number of files or upload sizes. Enabling excessive operations in a single request that can really overload your server from an operational standpoint, but also lead to the excessive data exposure. Returning massive volumes of records in a single request is another example. So the prevention here is, really put in those traffic controls, whether it's in a web application firewall or an API gateway or something like that. But potentially to implement logic within the application itself. For example, if you have an account reset capability, a legitimate user is going to attempt to provide a reset code once, twice, maybe 5 times. There's no one that's going to try 1,000 times. So regardless of whether they're rotating IP addresses and cleaning their cookies out, there's no user that's going to try 1,000 times. And so even though those attacks may make it through a traffic control, your application logic should account for that and basically disable that reset code after a certain number of attempts. Okay, number 5 is broken function level authorization. This is a carryover from the prior OWASP API top 10. This is really about providing functional access that's not warranted or not required by a particular user. In many cases, what an attacker will do is look at an endpoint that provides sort of a benign get type of request, a lookup type request, and attempt to use things like put and delete, and discover whether or not that those types of commands actually get executed or not. The exposure here is you can manipulate information, you can transact in ways that are not authorized, you could escalate privileges, modify account details, and so forth. So examples here are replacing things like get with put. So not only am I looking up my record, but I'm actually modifying it. Changing my role from a user to an admin. I could go in and maybe use a delete command to delete my invoice, or set the balance due to 0 or even to a negative number. So you see how sort of creative the attacks can be, and you really need to think not only about what your application should do, but how it how it could be abused. How might it be used in unintended ways? So from prevention standpoint, look at those business flows, those functions that are especially sensitive, right? That could result in a manipulation of data, an escalation of privilege, a performing of transactions that shouldn't be authorized to anyone but the legitimate user. And then implement controls and testing to make sure you're really properly vetting those endpoints across every possible combination of request type, and doing that on a continuous basis, right? On every release, on every push to production. Okay, that gets us halfway through the top 10. Moving to the bottom half, this is a new one, server-side resource forgery. I think it's been added because, this has been, a source of quite a lot of vulnerabilities. The idea here is API endpoints that accept URLs as input parameters provides an opening for malicious behavior, right? That URL upload or input can create a channel for access to third-party sites, malicious sites, downloading of malicious information or data or applications. Here's an example. A particular endpoint required the user to provide a URL. Maybe that was a URL of their LinkedIn address or something like that. Instead of putting a legitimate LinkedIn address, they inserted this localhost /API /user data. Maybe that was just a guess, but what they were doing is they're instructing the server to access this particular file on the host itself with user data and potentially return that data back to the requester, right? If we're not doing proper validation, then that might actually get executed, or you might point a URL to a malicious site where there may be malware or other binaries or key loggers or whatever it might be. And so the prevention here is very clear, right? You want to not trust anything, right? You have to validate and sanitize any user inputs, not just for URLs, but especially for URLs, and not trust any URLs that do not meet your requirements, whether it's, if it's a LinkedIn address, it needs to look like a LinkedIn address, or whatever it might be that your application is expecting, and then filter out everything that doesn't match. You do not just sort of blindly trust the user data that's being implemented. Again, you want to implement testing and fuzzing and attempting all kinds of different parameters into those inputs to ensure that nothing misbehaves, that your application doesn't process data that it shouldn't. Okay, on number 7, this is more or less a rename of the prior OWASP. This is security misconfiguration. Pretty broad category that basically encompasses all kinds of vulnerabilities that can result from misconfiguration, whether it's on the servers, the infrastructure, the network, the application themselves. It's looking for things that, these are vulnerabilities that bots and scanners often are looking for. It could be unpatched systems or services that shouldn't be running. The exposure here could be anything from lack of or a loss of data to full server compromise, right? So examples are a lack of hardening. So we're not properly hardening OSs and applications. We're not setting permissions properly for the applications, for the cloud services that they use, and the like. Missing security patches on libraries and applications used within our service. Unnecessary features enabled. No need to have SFTP enabled on a server if that's not a requirement for the application to run. Missing encryption, transport layer security, cores, cross-origin resource sharing. So you want to make sure that your APIs can only be accessed by properly sort of identified and approved sources. So if you've got missing cores policies, that's another potential source of a vulnerability. The prevention side, of course, implement proper hardening procedures across the entire stack. Review those procedures and test. Verify that all the all the infrastructure that you're running is properly secured and up to date. And number 8, lack of protection from automated threats. This is a new one, and it really reflects the use of automated or bot type of scans to look for vulnerabilities and then to harvest. So sort of these mass volume attacks and harvesting of data. The reality here is, attackers are quite creative about making their attacks look like different users from different sources, different IP addresses, different cookies, and so forth. So relying on simple rate limiting does not necessarily protect you from these types of abuses. Some of the examples are like mass automated ticket purchasing. We see this all the time, where you log in to purchase tickets and within 10 seconds they're all gone. Right? That's a high volume abuse of that particular resource that really should be prevented by the application itself. High volume rate referral bonuses. So if your application provides bonuses or credits for performing certain actions and you don't restrict how those are earned, you can find abuse here as well. So identify the critical business workflows where this type of abuse can happen. Implement traffic detection and control. So runtime monitoring as well as in-app logic controls to prevent high rate or high volume data exposures, and then test those controls. Make sure they're working properly. We've met with many a client where they've implemented runtime monitoring and blocking, only to discover that the blocking has been turned off and their WAF is now in a monitor mode, for example. So you need to test to make sure no changes happen that are unknown to you or unexpected, and that those controls are working as designed. OWASP number 9 is improper inventory management. This is a slight update of the old one, which was improper asset management. But the idea here is you need to have a really sort of comprehensive and accurate view of your API environment. All of the APIs that are running, all the endpoints, versions, older versions, who's accessing them, and so forth. What we find is attackers are going to look under the hood. They're going to look for old versions of API. So when you increment from version 3 of the API to version 4, what happens to version 3? Does it get retired? Does it stay accessible? Are there unpatched endpoints on that older version that you've corrected in the new version but still exist on that older version? Hackers are looking for those types of things. They know that those older editions may have endpoints with vulnerabilities or weaker security or outdated documentation. This is the kind of thing that they're looking for to exploit. So you want to, number one, deploy and manage all your APIs in a controlled fashion, typically through a gateway. Something where you ensure that everything that's going live has gone through a proper set of approvals and tests and validations before they go live. You want to define your rules for versioning and retirement, right? When you update an API from one version to the next, how do you communicate to all the constituents that need to have access to it? How are you retiring the old version, and under what conditions, and so forth? And then you want to audit. Make sure you're auditing, who's accessing your APIs. Do they still have legitimate access to it? Are they on the correct version of the APIs, and so forth? All right. And now the last one of the OWASP top 10, OWASP API security top 10, is unsafe consumption of APIs. This is a new one, and it really reflects the risk that you may experience from use of third-party APIs. The exposure can be data theft, breach, takeover, and so forth. But let's walk through an example of what this can look like. So let's say your application does user address verification. So they want to make sure that the address that they've inputted gets normalized and corrected and inserted into your database in a nice clean way. And for that you use a third-party data cleansing API. The attacker may be aware of this, or simply guess which third party you're using, and go into that third party and insert malicious data. Right, so maybe they're going to update their address information with, I'll use a silly example, but maybe their street address is drop table, right, or some command, right, something that can be abused. So what they'll do is they will come to your site, maybe fill out a loan application, insert that address as their address, and suddenly you have this injection command coming into your environment. Or another example is the use of redirects, right? So your third-party API instructs you to go to another site, to another resource indicator to fetch information. Well, that can be abused, and it can suddenly cause your site to get redirected to a third party or to a malicious site through this sort of third party infiltration. So the prevention here is to, again, not trust the data that's being inputted or being delivered to you. You want to validate, make sure that it looks and adheres to what you're expecting as the data that's being returned to you. You want to evaluate the security of your third parties. Make sure that they're doing proper security controls and testing and validation. Encryption goes without saying, but also have an inventory of all of those third-party APIs that you use, and make sure you're regularly auditing them. Now move into the three pillars of API security. So as I mentioned earlier on, the three pillars of API security are governance, testing, and monitoring. And we'll sort of dig into each one of these individually. Governance is really about defining and establishing and enforcing the processes of developing APIs, testing APIs, getting them into production in a consistent and secure way. Testing is really about ensuring that your APIs perform as expected and are also free of vulnerabilities or other flaws that can be exploited. And then monitoring is really about runtime monitoring of those APIs to make sure they're behaving as expected, there are not attacks in process that are succeeding, or other anomalous behavior on your APIs.
Signing up for APIsec University is easier than ever. Click Courses and find which one is right for you. Select the course and click Enroll Now. Fill out the form with your first and last name, email, and company if applicable. Click Submit and then check your email for password setup instructions. Join us and earn your badges today.
So let's focus on governance first. The benefits of governance is really about establishing consistency. It's consistency in how your APIs get developed, how they get deployed, how they get tested, and everything else. Setting expectations for your engineering team. What is required? What are those documentation requirements and authentication policies and versioning and so forth? Establishing standard processes, how APIs move from development into production in a very consistent way, and enforcing security, making sure that nothing moves into production that hasn't gone through the same level of security assessment and vetting. And there are really two sort of, components to governance. There's an awareness side, which is about having proper visibility. What APIs do you have? What infrastructure are they running on? What data do they have access to? What risks do these APIs bring along with them? And then there's a policy and process side, which is really, how do we go about the development of our APIs? How do we go about, deploying them? What documentation, what design requirements do we have for these applications? So on the awareness side, this is really about knowing your APIs, right? Gaining a full inventory of your APIs. Why do they exist? Who owns them? How are they documented? What functionality do they offer? Where are they? All of that kind of granular information. You want to have a comprehensive view of across all your APIs. You want to know your infrastructure, right? The app architecture, the containers, the virtual machines, the databases being connected to, the network infrastructure. Really, have a good understanding of how everything sort of interconnects. You want to standardize your deployment process so that APIs only get deployed in approved ways with proper validation. Nothing gets out there. None of this shadow or rogue APIs, as it's often called. Frankly, if that's happening, you've got weak governance. There should be no ability for APIs to get into production without your knowledge, without going through these proper channels. And the best way to enforce that is through use of something like an API gateway or a marketplace. So you have the central kind of control point where all APIs are in that infrastructure being managed properly, and you know that they've gone through the proper validation steps. Definitely make API documentation mandatory. This is critical for sort of the use of those APIs across the engineering organization, or even with your third-party clients and partners. It also is critical for testing and validation and security, right? So make it mandatory and define what those documentation requirements are, and create design guides for API development, so that these APIs get developed and produced in a very consistent and reusable manner. The next element of awareness is risk and threat modeling, right? So you want to understand the nature of those APIs. What are they? What business flows do they power? What data do they have access to? Who has access to it? Roles and access controls and the like. You want to assess your risk, right? What vulnerabilities exist? What logic flaws? What access controls or third party? And that's really through testing, right? You want to make sure you have a proper understanding of the security posture of your APIs. Look at probability of attack, right? Is this data highly sensitive and highly valuable, or is it really, fairly benign and of low value to an attack? That will help you with your prioritization. Understand the impact, right? What's the the nature of an exploit? What kind of damage? What kind of loss? What consequences can result? And then finally, to define a sort of a response plan. How are you going to respond to an attack if and when it happens, and how will you address those risks? So then, moving on to documentation. This is worthy of its own sort of chapter in the training here. It's we run across many organizations where the documentation is patchy or incomplete or non-existent. It's absolutely crucial to be documenting properly your APIs. It's not only important for security, it's also important for development and for enabling the use of those APIs. The Open API specification, known as OAS, or formerly known as Swagger, or if you've ever heard of a Swagger file, this is really kind of the industry standard for documenting REST APIs. Looks like machine readable content. It's typically YAML or JSON. It doesn't only help integration and use of your APIs, but it also aids in security, right? Testing can be built around your API documentation, and even runtime monitoring can be aided through this type of documentation. You want to control your documentation, so what you're publishing publicly on the internet has only the documentation that's required to be published publicly. There are very easy ways to find Open API specifications on organization websites. So find what those are that you're publishing. Make sure you're only publishing what deserves to be out there, and make sure you're retiring old documentation. This is a huge threat vector. Attackers are looking for it, and you want to make sure you're not keeping content out there that can be used against you. The documentation itself will define really everything about your API, right? The functionality, the endpoints, the description, where the API exists, the base URL, all the endpoints, the payloads, authentication requirements, the input parameters and data types, what methods are supported. And you want to generate this specification as much as possible through automation. You want to instrument your code repos to automatically generate this API specification. Insert the necessary comments and details into the repos to make sure that documentation comes out as complete as possible. And just to show you what it can look like, this is kind of on the left-hand side what the raw code, the raw sort of YAML or JSON of a Swagger file will look like. But there are plenty of Swagger parsers or Open API spec parsers, which will turn that into what you'll commonly see on sort of API portals that you might employ on your own public website, right? So it'll help a consumer of your API to understand in plain English and visual sort of interfaces what your API does. But over on the left-hand side, you'll see like what the machine readable versions of these documentations look like. From a design guide perspective, you really do want to establish standards for your organization. How you're going to authenticate users, what type of authentication, where you use different types of authentication. You want to define authorization. So, how do you control who has access to what and where you're going to enforce that? Even things like naming conventions. Typically, you want your URIs to be nouns. The methods to be the verbs, whether you're posting a new record or putting a new value in or deleting. Things like pluralization and hierarchy and language and lack of jargon and things like that. Your error codes you want to make sure involve status codes, reference IDs, human readable messages, but make sure those messages aren't revealing useful information back to a potential attacker. So if you get an error code, you don't want to have the error code say, expecting this type of data, because that's simply informing an attacker how to attack your API. Things like versioning, when to increment, when not to, units and formats and standards. I poked around and found this on Atlassian's site. Here's an example of their design guide for authentication. Right, so every REST API must have at minimum basic user authentication. Authorization is not handled at the API layer. It's actually the responsibility of the application itself. Right, so that's defined right here in their design guide. Similarly, they have a section on versions. Right, when do you need a new version? When do you not need a version? What happens to the old versions? So these are the kinds of things you as an organization should be thinking about and defining proactively. So moving on to the next element of the three pillars of API security is testing. And here the goal is really to ensure that your APIs are free of vulnerabilities, lack business logic flaws, and the like. And the question here, where do you want to find them? Do you want to find them pre-production or in production? Naturally, the best practice is to make security testing part of your testing program. Virtually every line of code gets tested for functionality, for unit testing, for performance. It should also be getting tested for security as part of your CI/CD pipeline so that every single release gets evaluated. Now, the sort of standard playbook of security tests tends to look at things like cross-site scripting, injections, buffer overflow attacks, and the like. There are lots of ways to find these, and they are important tests to run. But if you recall from the earlier section on those real-world breaches, none of those were a result of an injection or a cross-site scripting, right? For the most part, they were logic flaws in the application themselves. So you need to make sure that your testing program looks way beyond sort of the standard playbook type things, but to the unique functionality of your application. And we're big proponents of what we call API first testing. Historically, the sort of application testing has focused on the UI layer itself, whether it's a web app or a mobile app. But what attackers are doing is simply going around that right to the API itself. Right, you saw that in many of the examples that we shared earlier, and that's why I like this quote from our good friend Corey Ball, who wrote the Hacking APIs book and created our pen testing course. most of our web or API flaws are getting missed by the standard tests, right? It's not injections that are causing these breaches. It's lack of authentication. It's lack of authorization. It's things like that are exposing data that are then getting harvested in vast quantities from sites. It's not really abuse of the UI layer, it's abuse of the API layer. So we strongly recommend this concept of API first testing. And that's why we've created a little plug for our API pen testing course on APIsec University. The main point here is to show you kind of how extensive the skill set and the testing needs to be. You can see on the right hand side, right, the course goes through things like how to perform API recon. This is what hackers are going to do against you. How to analyze the endpoints and scan them for vulnerabilities. How to perform authentication and authorization attacks. Looking for improper asset management, like old versions and unsupported endpoints and out of date documentation. Mass assignment attacks where you're modifying records and changing functionality, doing injection attacks and doing high rate limit type of attacks as well, and combining them all together into more sophisticated attacks. So for folks who need to really develop those types of skills, this is a great resource. It's totally free. We provide full certification, as you can see there, but highly recommended to develop this type of skill set to really understand the security posture of your APIs. And when you're looking at what kinds of things you should be testing for, this is by no means comprehensive, but should give you sort of a taste of the type of testing and coverage that you need. Broken into these three categories. So from a security standpoint, looking for unsecured endpoints and authentication exploits, the enumeration like those incrementing IDs, looking for rate limit issues and lack of encryption, fuzzing, and the server side resource forgery, properties leaks. All that sort of falls into the API security. Then you've got data security type of tests, right? So who's got access? What controls do you have in place? Are there gaps in those controls? Are we returning too much data? Are we returning sensitive data? Are we exposing file structures and directories? Are we encrypting the data? How can data get exfiltrated from our platform? And then over on the far right, the business logic. This is what's unique to you. What are the business flows that your application enables? How can those APIs be abused? What access controls do you have in place to make sure user A can't access user B's functionality? And doing pen testing regularly and in an automated fashion on every release. The third pillar we'll go through quickly here is monitoring. And they're really this pillar is all about kind of understanding how your APIs are performing and operating in production. So we're looking at like runtime protection, actually active protection of the APIs, right? Policy enforcement, requiring authentication of users to access endpoints, filtering traffic. Maybe we need a geo filter traffic. We're only expecting traffic from a certain region or IP address and so forth. So that's an aspect of real-time runtime protection that you can implement. The next category is threat detection, right? So how do we analyze the traffic to look for things like fraudulent transactions, fraudulent traffic, distributed attacks, right? So attacks that are coming from lots of different sources that are targeting similar resource or performing similar functionality, and you want to be alerted to that and make sure you're controlling it properly, as well as incident response, right? So you could capture all the traffic, you can log it all, you can put it into a repository to then retrace the steps and understand what happened, and then implement the appropriate mitigating controls for future similar attacks. And then you want to validate controls, right? Make sure that all the controls that you've implemented at the gateway, at the firewall, in the application itself are functioning as designed, right? That there aren't any surprises happening in production that you weren't expecting, that you're finding any anomalies or unexpected traffic from going unnoticed and without control. Now, there are really two fundamental approaches to runtime monitoring. There's a proactive sort of blocking approach, which you'll find with things like a gateway or a web app firewall. Here's where you can actually sort of enforce policy, right? You can define in a gateway that these endpoints are only accessible with valid authentication, and they actually performed the authentication. Or with a firewall, maybe you want to implement rate limiting or IP whitelisting or these types of things, and if the traffic doesn't match, it gets blocked. The other side is more of a reactive, like alerting mode for monitoring. Here you want to probably capture all the traffic, log it, put it into a SIM or a log management type of solution, or a runtime API threat management tool. The idea here is, you may not have enough context in order to make judgments about whether the traffic is legitimate or not. So you want to get alerted, you want to be notified, you want to be able to retrace steps, because the last thing you want to do is block legitimate traffic. And there may be instances where there's just simply not enough context to be able to make a yes/no decision on it. So you want to then have that alerting, that monitoring ability to go back and understand the traffic and maybe refine the rules for your sort of more inline proactive technologies. Another aspect of monitoring is to do API discovery, right? To actually watch what's happening on the wire, on your network, to identify APIs that are in use and active on your network. This can be useful for generating that inventory, for discovering APIs that were undiscovered, for finding undocumented or unknown APIs or unknown endpoints and the like. But you need to be aware that this is not necessarily going to give you a complete view, right? If your goal is a comprehensive inventory of all your APIs, which it should be to satisfy those governance requirements, you need to look well beyond this, right? Because APIs may exist within the firewall that are not being seen by your monitoring tool. You want to be scanning code repositories to look for these types of APIs, or crawling or app testing. But that's how you're going to get a comprehensive view. And ultimately, you want to enforce that all APIs are being managed centrally in something like an API gateway. And the other limitation of discovery is, if you're looking at network-based discovery, it's only going to see what it sees, right? So if there are APIs that exist inside the firewall on network segments that aren't monitored, you're not going to see them. If there are APIs that aren't being exercised or endpoints that aren't being touched, you're not going to see them. So you really want to have a more comprehensive approach to discovery and finding all of your API footprint. The other limitations of monitoring, we sort of talked about it, is the visibility, but it's very appealing to think that you can insert something in line that will magically protect you from all sorts of threats. But the reality is, live traffic has very limited context. If you look at, say, the Coinbase example, where user A was trading crypto on behalf of user B, any inline tool is going to see simply an HTTP request that's got a source account, a destination account, an order, some other details, but it's very unlikely that there's going to be knowledge at the inline tool level to know if that's a legitimate transaction, whether that source account or destination account belongs to the user that is requesting it. That's why we implement authorization at the app level, right? That's where the context exists to know, is Dan accessing Dan's records or is he accessing Jeff's? And so, inline tools are great for monitoring, but are very likely to miss a lot of active attacks. So you want to make sure you're actually attack simulating to find where those vulnerabilities are before they go live and to implement the appropriate corrections. The other thing about monitoring is, in many cases, if you're going to implement API monitoring technologies, that may well mean sharing your data with third parties. And that may be a violation of privacy issues, can cause bandwidth concerns, or even latency. So things to be aware of when you're looking at monitoring capabilities. Final section here is on the application security technology landscape. So cybersecurity is a pretty, large area, large market. And I'm not going to go through all of this because it's way too much, but there are many, many facets and aspects to cybersecurity. What we're focusing in on here for this conversation is application security, for which there are many technologies. You've got static code analyzers, dynamic testers, software composition analysis, containers, web app firewalls, and so forth. And these are all very well known and widely deployed technologies. But the reality is as you've seen from these API breaches, there's a new class of risk, of attack vector that is targeting APIs, and they're being successful. And it's revealing that the existing technologies have gaps in their coverage. So let's dig into that a little bit deeper. Here you see kind of a very simplified pipeline from developing technologies to deploying them to operating them, or developing applications through deployment and operation. And in the development phase, you've got security tools that'll look at your code, look for, coding weaknesses and injection flaws or weak authentication, config issues. Might look at your third-party, libraries and, outdated or known vulnerable code that might be your application may be relying on, and so forth. And over on the far right, when we get into production, you've got technologies like gateways and threat management tools that will handle authentication, do some level of authorization controls, do traffic management to rate limit and control where your traffic is coming from, what's permitted, what's not, to log all the activities, to do anomaly detection, and so forth. But here in the middle is, I think, where the biggest gap has existed in terms of security, which is security testing, especially API security testing. You may be familiar with web application scanners and the like, designed to interact with web interfaces and mobile interfaces. APIs don't have anything like that. The interface is a machine interface. It's a flashing cursor prompt. There's no structure, there's no standard workflow presented at an API level, right? And so you need to really implement comprehensive, effective security testing at the API level. Things that will test all those OWASP categories. Things that will test the business logic of your application, that will exploit or evaluate any authentication weaknesses that exist or authorization gaps, logic flaws, and really simulate all those types of scenarios in a very comprehensive way. And you want to be accomplishing all that left of this dotted line, right? The whole concept of shift left. Implement this type of security testing on every release as part of your CI/CD pipeline, so that every push to production goes through the same hurdles, the same evaluations, and if anything is being discovered, you're knowing about it before it ever makes it into production. And that's why automation is so critical, right? You can't run a manual pen test on every release, whether that's happening every week or every night. It's not feasible, right? So automation is critical here as well. So that wraps up the core of the course here. I wanted to conclude with a few final thoughts, some best practices. A couple of slides here. So number one is really around governance, right? So take the time to define your policies, to define your standards, define your processes. Make sure that no API goes live without going through the proper process, right? Not passing all the gates of documentation, testing, security validation. A gateway is a great place to enforce that and to make sure that all your APIs are being managed and deployed and operated in a consistent fashion. Number two is to implement a comprehensive testing program so that every endpoint gets tested across every attack vector that exists. You want to run every combination of test on every data object, user type, every function, every method, and really, give yourself that comprehensive coverage, right? And the reality of this means, generating literally thousands of attack scenarios to pressure test your API across all those different vectors. And to do this, the only way to achieve this is through automation and continuous testing. So you want to implement something that will fit into your CI/CD pipeline, that will execute all of that test coverage, and to do so on every release. Although APIs rarely change, like the actual API endpoints themselves, doesn't mean you don't need to test regularly, because a vulnerability can creep in through code changes, through infrastructure changes, and those can happen anytime, right? So continuous testing is really crucial here. And then finally, to develop a set of metrics, a way to track your progress. How many vulnerabilities are being found? How quickly are they being mitigated? And so forth. So really, add some metrics and process to this. My last slide here is kind of a list of do's and don'ts. Some pretty tactical things that hopefully you can take back and implement here as you go on. We'll just step through these. So, all right, don't trust anything. I've talked about this a number of times. Don't trust the inputs. Don't trust the network. Don't trust anything. You need to validate all those inputs. Make sure that the parameters, the inputs that are coming into your API match what's expected, and toss away everything else. It can be malicious. You shouldn't be processing it. Don't confuse obfuscation with security, right? So just because you're obfuscating your code, doesn't mean it can't be reverse engineered or unobfuscated, but just keep sensitive data out of your code. No keys, no tokens, nothing hard-coded. That's what attackers are going to look for. They're going to look for keys and then try to reuse them themselves to gain access and to perform, data exfiltration and the like. Don't reveal useful info in error messages, right? If you need to say, you're not authenticated, that's enough. You don't need to say, we're expecting an 8-digit numerical number, right? That's info that does not need to be shared back. Don't have hidden or unadvertised features. I was talking to one organization where they have a published API, and then they have unpublished API, and they acknowledge that that they expect users will actually go and reverse engineer some of this stuff and start using it. Don't do that. Don't leave it to your users to figure out what's possible. Make sure you control what's accessible, how it can be accessed, what functionality you're making available. Don't filter data in the UI. That is not the job of your UI. That's the job of your app, right? So, and this goes back to sort of the API first principles. The application itself should control what data is coming out. The UI's job is simply to present, not to enforce or control. Don't confuse authentication with authorization. Authentication is about me demonstrating that I'm me. Your application needs to control what I can see and under what circumstances. Do use gateways to control traffic and to really centralize your management. All APIs need to be controlled and managed in a consistent way. Do require API documentation. This is an absolute must, non-optional. Make sure that your APIs are properly documented, and not only for internal use, but for security purposes. That documentation is critical to being able to properly test and validate the functionality of your API. Do expect hackers to find and use those undocumented endpoints, as I mentioned a little earlier, and do continuously test on every release, every push to production. Simulate attacks, look at your configs, do injections, do fuzzing, test authentication, test authorization, and the like. And so with that, I thank you for your attention. I appreciate you making the time to take this course. My name's Dan Barahona, and I welcome you to connect with me. If you've got questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and I appreciate you taking the time.